I always say to my team, and speaking about always on, that it's important that we actually, do get the headspace, that we need to be both good advisors and also to be creative about the solutions that we go with. So to me, having the right flow of data give you a bit more headspace because you don't need to second guess.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Always On, your podcast about brand, reputation, and data-driven communications. It's a sunny day in Copenhagen, which doesn't happen often, and today I'm doing something quite unusual. I'm interviewing a guest who is also based in Copenhagen, and that is Pia Stoklund. Pia is Global Head of Corporate Marketing and Communication at DSV, which is the global logistics leader that literally last week doubled its workforce more or less to 160,000 people. So that's great timing to have you with us. Welcome to Always On, Pia.
Thank you, Shahar. Pleasure to be here.
So you and I know each other for a long time, but to our listeners who don't know you, why don't you tell us who is Pia Stockland?
Oh, that's a difficult one to kick this off with, Shahar. So I'm first and foremost the mother of three sons, grown up now. Such a privilege to see the world through their eyes. Professionally, I've been within the field of communications, branding, marketing for around 25 years. Started out on, you could say, the business side, being a business consultant. Always found the kind of how do you gain the right impact? How do you make real changes? Super interesting, which took me into communication, which took me into how to facilitate dialogues with stakeholders in order for stakeholders to trust and support what you're doing as a company.
So let's rewind a little bit to the very, very beginning. So you already touched on that, and I want to understand that a little bit better. What got you into this world of comms in the very beginning? How did you start your career in communications?
So I actually started out in finance, and then, as I said before, as a consultant at Schenker. Then I quite quickly found that this is about how do you actually impact things? How do you make a change happen? That was what was kind of driving me, what I was curious about, and that is very closely related to comms, and then that was kind of my way into corporate communications.
And as unusual as it sounds, we've already had another guest on the show that also made a switch from finance to comms. So it sounds like it is actually a route that many people take. And you also mentioned in your intro that you've gone through several industries and sectors throughout your career. And I'm curious to hear, how do you think that has benefited you as a communicator to actually work in these different environments, different sectors?
It's understanding where different people, different stakeholders come from, what is their reality, what is their perception, then gaining a strong understanding of the industry, the company that I work within, and then to try to see, so where do we have that sweet spot of common interest so we can start having a dialogue, maybe a collaboration, maybe a partnership, and gain stakeholder trust and support. And then no matter the industry, no matter the company, you have many different stakeholders. And then, it's just a matter of entering into a new industry and another company, but it's the approach, the curiosity of actually gaining that understanding and finding that sweet spot where you can start a conversation that matters. So I think that is what has taken me, through many different industries and companies. And then you asked, what have I gained from that? Was that your question?
Well, if you feel as a communicator, it actually gave you a rounder perspective or different, more dimensions to look at things and how you work.
It has fueled my curiosity and also understanding of that the world is often more complex than what it looks like at the first sight. So you might think that employees are driven by this and that. But when you then dive into it, and then when you have seen many different stakeholder groups in many different industries, you need to dive a bit deeper and not make assumptions.
Yeah, so in a sense, it challenges you also as a communicator to be in different sectors and understand that sometimes there's other perspectives that you're missing.
Yeah, exactly.
And you mentioned a 25-year career, and I'm curious how you see the evolution of our landscape, the communication landscape. How do you think it's changed mostly over the course of your career?
I think it used to be much more transactional and much more kind of a bilateral exchange with a certain stakeholder group. So, of course, you were selling to your customers, you were talking to your employees. When the media called, you answered, and then the next day you would see something on print. So that was how it used to be. I think today it's much more, one would say, complex, an ecosystem, holistic. You have many dialogues going at the same time. And you cannot be, as transactional targeted in your interactions, because you do, no matter where if you host a town hall internally, you need to be mindful that this will be on social media, 30 seconds later. Then it could travel to the traditional media, then it could go to, to customers. And so it's and the pace is much faster. So it is much more kind of an ecosystem with a lot of different connections than it used to be.
Absolutely, and we're finding that too, that this kind of growing complexity is one of the things that we're seeing that the world is changing in, and this growing complexity also means that there's a lot more volatility and there's a lot more speed in how things are going, and in many ways that also means that communication teams need to be always on, hence the name of our podcast. How do you find that you are individually, or are you individually always on in that sense as well?
Yeah, and especially so when when heading a comms and marketing function with a presence in a company with a presence in more than 90 countries. So yes, this is pretty much a 24/7 job, and of course you need to find structures that support that, because of course no individual can be on 24/7. Yeah, so definitely I recognize it. I also recognize the challenge of building structures that make it possible to be always on.
And what are some of those structures? Or if you think about your team, how do they stay always on? What kind of tools do they use to stay always on or always aware of what's going on? What are some of the tools and the structures or the processes that help them do that?
What we currently do is, we have the media surveillance, we have internal structures with team sites and the like, where we share what is going on in different regions, and that way try to stay on top of things. Then we of course have the dialogues, when we have surveys, so different kind of measures.
And what would you say is the way today for communication teams to measure success in an always-on environment?
Back then, when we were more transactional, then you kind of had, of course, we also had objectives, KPIs at that point in time, but then you had kind of an annual survey, an annual report that then showed you how things were going, and then you said, okay, that's fine, and then you got your bonus or you didn't, right? More or less, to be a bit black and white. Today, in order to navigate the complexity, the much more interrelated stakeholder relations, communications paths, you need to be able to make much more informed decisions here and now, which call for a much more data-driven and more real-time intelligence than what we used to have.
And would you say that one of the main differences then from traditional metrics for measuring success to today's metrics is the fact that it's more frequent, more always on, more real-time? or is it also the type of metrics that teams are looking at?
Yeah, both, I think. And then this also because, many more processes, in daily life, but also in corporate life are data-based, data-driven. So this is not just about getting data that tells you how you have performed in the past. My internal stakeholders expect me to have, data to base my advice and recommendation on. So I think it's much more that you try to get data that can actually steer your decisions instead of just, looking back.
Yeah, and that's probably the key aspect, that is data that is quick enough to be able to help you make a decision now rather than reflect back.
Yeah, I also think one aspect that I want to call out here is that, for instance, when you go through a reputational crisis, then as a CCO, that can take up all your time. It can also take up a lot of resources at top management, and it can become very big. So in order to calibrate that perception, because that is what you work with 24/7, to calibrate that and get a more realistic view on how is this actually being perceived. So to get that data in to steer your decisions, your approach, instead of that being driven by how you sense things are, because they tend to be, it comes with a bias, because it's even if you, of course, we all try to be super professional and saying, okay, this is because I work with this 24/7. It's probably not that big, but it tends to become bigger than it actually is my experience at least. And I think what real-time data can do is to provide you and top management with a more realistic picture of how things are actually being perceived, because many stakeholders, they don't only think about you and your company. They have many different agendas, and that's just one point that I wanted to call out. And then of course it's interesting to see, for instance, if you have a reputational crisis issue, whether it travels across borders, whether it travels across stakeholder groups, because at least how I tend to see it is, if you have, it might be a big case, for instance, in Danish media, but if customers, investors, employees are not reacting, and if it's contained to Danish media, even if it's not to underestimate the harm that can do, but that's one case. But if you see that it's jumping to others, across stakeholder groups or across countries, then it's a totally different case, and it's just so important to be able to follow that very closely and in real time, and not something that you then get to know
too late.
Too late.
Do you have a story you can share with us from the past where something like this was actually put to action, where you used real-time data to actually make a smarter decision?
Yeah, so I think when I worked at Nets, we also had our fair share of critical media, and we went from being you could say a Nordic, a Danish company, and then went on to an M&A journey throughout Europe. For instance, we saw signs that a certain media case that we had in Denmark, then we saw signs that the perceptions in Germany were also, changing a bit, even though it didn't jump to German media. But then we could dive into, so what are the mechanisms here? Which stakeholders should we actually engage in dialogue with to try to mitigate this before it becomes too big? And you would never be able to do that if you knew about it, 6 months later.
So you used real-time perception data across geographies in order to inform some mitigating activities before something became too big of a problem.
Yeah. And also to learn, now I'm talking a lot about kind of media issues, media crisis, but also when you aim at building a certain position, then, for instance, the media efforts, the marketing, also paid, the efforts that you are making to take that position, build that position. Does it resonate? Instead of just throwing money after money, making additional investments. So actually to see now we are running, if we talk earned media with these kind of stories, do we see a difference or don't we? And if we, tweak it a little bit here, do we see another reaction? And then if we see a certain reaction in one country, can we scale it? Instead of, going out, especially when it's also paid, instead of going out with, one effort that you believe works across many geographies, try it out, see how it resonates, and then you can scale it.
Okay, so you've also used that for optimizing activities, budget allocation, and so on to become more effective.
Yeah.
So data-driven communication is obviously a big topic, both on the podcast, but also generally in communications today. But there's also this other side of communications, which is the human side and the creative side. How do you see the balance between those?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I always say to my team that I mean, and speaking about always on, that it's important that we actually, do get the headspace, that we need to be both good advisors and also to be creative about the solutions that we go with. So to me, having the right flow of data actually give you a bit more headspace, because you don't need to second guess. You actually have some data. Then of course you need to analyze, but that also gets easier when you understand data better and better. And then to me, you need to have that headspace and that ability to, add the thing that you cannot, call out in an Excel sheet, but that you sense is the right thing to do based on experience built throughout many years and many kinds of stakeholder interactions. So one thing is data, and then you of course need to do the more hardcore interpretation of those data, and then you need to have the headspace to add that thing that you can only gain, I think, by a lot of experience.
That's an interesting perspective. So you're saying actually that the data can also free you to focus your creativity in an area that is going to be effective, rather than to explore too much. So in a sense, you see one reinforcing the other.
Yeah, definitely.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, what about leadership visibility in an always-on world? I mean, how have you yourself in your career adapted executive communication strategies to meet new expectations when it comes to how visible leadership should be and the type of decision-making that leadership should make? How has that affected your work, or how has that changed over the years?
It has changed quite dramatically, I think, in the sense that back then, for instance, I mean, you had your CEO out in the big tier 1 interviews, and that was, at least when we speak externally, the main channel. Now I tend to say that the main channel is, you could say, LinkedIn and the communication there, because it's much more frequent and it's more authentic, personal, and that is what many stakeholders expect. that you also share more of yourself. That is not just the role. You want to, you build trust to a human being. So to get that across has become much more important. And also internally, I remember back then when we introduced a CEO blog on the internet. That was a big thing. I mean, listening to the CEO reflecting and not just knowing everything, that was, a big thing back then. And now it's, I mean, you need to have that open line. You need to have town halls where colleagues feel that top management is approachable. You can enter into a dialogue. They share a bit of themselves and not just kind of the standard answer to everything. And also, CEOs being open about not knowing everything, interviewing actually colleagues, to turn things around. I think that has become much more common.
I can imagine it's been a challenging development, because I know a lot of leaders are not comfortable being transparent and sharing more about who they are. as people, not just as leaders. How have you, or what are the tactics that you've used over the years to actually get collaboration from CEOs and I guess the C-suite in general in this type of development?
I think there's a big difference to me between being private and being personal. And you don't have to be private, so to say, but share, personal reflections. I think that distinction actually make it a bit easier for many, that it's not that I need to, share what this is not about necessarily sharing what you do in your spare time. This is more about having a personal perspective on things and showing that it's not just this way, that you actually have reflections around a certain topic.
Do you find that the need for leadership visibility and the growing need in an always-on environment, do you find that also means that the relationship that you as a CCO have with the CEO becomes closer because you need to align a lot more on topics and on what the CEO talks about or the positions that the company takes?
Since there are many more interactions, the collaboration between top management and communication is also much more, frequent and continuous dialogue, instead of now we have our next quarterly result and now we prepare for that. They communicate every day, and therefore, you have to have that continuous dialogue.
Yeah, and in that context, I would imagine that this development, this change is also part of what's making the communications or the CCO role more strategic, no? Because it's more of a direct advisor to the CEO on many different topics all the time.
We can all communicate all the time, right? So it's about being strategic about it, right? So which topics, which platforms, which target audiences, so which kind of dialogues do you want to create by what you're doing? So I think that's also where we as strategic advisors come into play, because otherwise, honestly, you could have a personal assistant working, writing the posts, but to actually have an impact and create trust and create support for the company's reason to exist and objectives, then you need to be quite strategic about it, because there's so many, different interactions, but to leave a mark and make an impact, they need to be pretty much on message and very well thought through, and not just, another post here, internally, external, as you sometimes see still, I think.
For sure. And hopefully this is one of the elements where the human factor of a good communicator comes into play, something that an AI assistant won't be able to do as well. Let's talk a bit about the internal aspect of communication, because you're currently leading a very big workforce, certainly after the Schenker acquisition. You've led also a big workforce at Pandora, I believe more than 30,000 colleagues there. How do you approach communicating effectively to such diverse audiences globally, across cultures, across regions, I guess also across types of employees, but still maintaining a consistency of message, consistency of brand? How have you dealt with that in the past and today?
I remember 25 years ago, we talked about the importance of line communication. So leaders communication and leaders as the most important comms channel, actually. And I think we are still, working on that as as comms professionals. But it's still so true that if you can both communicate, convey the expectation to leaders that they actually have this more strategic communication role. It's not just about giving feedback to employees. It's also about connecting what is happening in the team to the bigger picture. For instance, if you can enable them to do that and set a direction, employee engagement would, everything being equal, increase. So I think conveying the expectation and enabling leaders is just very, very important. And there you can also adjust to local traditions, circumstances, but you of course still need to have a core that is the same across. For instance, at Pandora, when we had a capital markets day and a refresh of our strategy, that's where you take the 300 of capital markets day slides and put it into a narrative on a one-pager. This is actually who we are and the direction we are taking. So that it's, I wouldn't say easy because it's not an easy task, but at least leaders can relate to it and use it in their daily communication with their teams. So make it simple. Leaders are super, super busy people, but they also want to do good. So if you can put together, that one pager with a strong narrative and then a few tips and tricks, tools that they can use in their daily interactions with their teams, I think you can gain a lot when it comes to employee engagement.
So is it fair to say that whether it's 1,000 employees or 100,000 employees, it doesn't really change that much as long as you can simplify and give a clear, consistent message to the leaders, to the managers and the leaders in the different regions? Yeah,
and then build the right infrastructure. So for instance, here at DSV, when I joined the company 6 months ago, we had, of course, an intranet, but it was very much driven or very focused on global news only. And then you need to build an infrastructure so that you can support, enable leaders. So now we have an executive leadership site for top 400, and then we have a leadership site for all leaders across the company, where we provide the one-pager, the presentation that they can use in team meetings, a few communication tips and tricks and tools. And we have, a certain cadence of meetings where we share the direction ahead, and now a lot, of course, about the integration. So it's building that infrastructure that could support, and that, is of course different if you have 1,000 people or 160,000 people, but it is a matter of building, having the right rails, and then, use those in your communication.
Yeah, and you also basically drew a parallel between, or made a connection between communication internally and alignment, because it's one thing to be able to communicate a simple message yourself, the CEO, or through the different managers and leaders in the company. It's another thing to actually obtain alignment with the company's brand and strategy across a very wide workforce. So do you have any thoughts on that, or any tips on how do you also obtain alignment through a very diverse workforce, like in the case of Pandora, where you were responsible for that?
To me, it was very important at Pandora to establish a global team. So even if the local communicators reported into the regional management, to establish that community where we, of course, also had the feedback. So what is working, what is not working, what should we adjust? But that we had a very clear, actually, playbook for doing that. So we had clear roles and responsibilities. This is our narrative. These are the measures that we are using. This is the cadence we meet with, and this is how you provide feedback. So to get that global network going, instead of just sitting at the headquarters and pushing out comms, but really having strong ambassadors in the countries to also, of course, to adjust again to local differences.
And are you finding now, switching into the role at DSV, that you can use the same structures when you have such a large, even larger, I guess, now almost more than 5 times larger workforce and more diverse workforce? Are you finding that you're using the similar processes and tools as you did before to do that?
Yeah, so we are definitely on a journey building that kind of approach now, also because DSV, with its new strategy that they launched, I say they because I was not part of it, but beginning of last year, is much more of an enterprise approach, where we are much more one DSV and doing things more in the same way. And it's back to, I wouldn't call my colleagues infrastructure, but it is, again, back to having the right infrastructure, but also the right core. Make it, what is this brand about? What is our narrative? What is our aspiration? And then it's about integrated communication and using the right infrastructure to get it out there. And of course, speaking about integrated communication, last week with our closing of the acquisition of Schenker, we have an integration tagline called Winning as One, and a visual and some key messages around that. To see that, I mean, for days on social media, also running internally, actually also coming through in media interviews. That is, I mean, that's a proud moment, of course, because that is when you see that the infrastructures you have built and the core that you have in your messaging, that they come together, and then I mean, the impact is just so much bigger.
I'm sure. Let's look a little bit into the future as much as we can. I mean, what are you seeing as the main trends or the main changes you think are coming to the communication landscape over the next 5 years?
The expectation of even more dialogue is probably one of them. So when I kind of joined a bank back then, 25 years ago, as an employee, you just expected the top management to, you know, set a direction. This is how we do it. And then we all, I mean, ran in that direction, right? To put it a bit black and white. And then we have seen a development where, you know, you have more interaction. But I think the next generation's expectations of co-creation, co-shaping things, and that's now I take the example of employees, but I think that cuts across stakeholders. That this about that you just want to influence, you know, someone, and then they should make the right decision. That's not how it works. You know, you need to have it's a two-way street, and I think it will become that even more so in the future, which calls for different ways of working, both within communication and marketing, and in general, actually, as a business.
So also in terms of, if you look at the corporate communication function in terms of the structure, the organization, do you see that also changing in the years to come?
I still see a potential for corporate communication, and there are definitely geographical differences across the globe, but the acknowledgement of bringing that multi-stakeholder perspective to the table and being part of the decisions, I still think actually across many companies and industries there's still a pretty big potential. But since, as I said before, I think the trend will be that you expect as a stakeholder much more dialogue, much more interaction, much more co-creation. The multi-stakeholder perspective will only, I mean, the importance of that will only grow. And therefore, the voice of the stakeholders is, in my mind, only becoming even more important in decision processes. So I don't know whether, you know, structurally or structure-wise, but I hope that more companies acknowledge that need of having the multi-stakeholder perspective as part of their decision processes.
What about the CCO role itself? Do you see that role evolving as well? Or how do you see that role evolving?
Of course, it's evolving all the time, but from pushing out communication to facilitating dialogue. So identifying the right arenas for facilitating dialogues with different stakeholders, it's quite a different discipline than what it used to be. Also, I mean, and is still in some industries, I would say, just you know, tell them what to do.
So you're saying, if I hear you correctly, you're saying the CCO themselves need to be less of kind of a top-down, what's the message kind of person, and more of a person who knows how to facilitate dialogues across different stakeholders, different people.
And therefore, they also need to be in close dialogues themselves and have the right intelligence so that you know how stakeholders feel and think and behave, because otherwise it's difficult to facilitate the right interactions, the right dialogues. For sure.
Okay, and in that sense, that also means that the CCO themselves also need to be more comfortable with data and actually being able to process a bigger volume of data.
Yeah. So it's becoming much more about listening in a broad sense than just broadcasting.
How does that relate to the CMO? You're in a position now where you're both CMO and CCO. How do you see the divide between the two? What do you see as the main differences now that you're in that type of role?
But I actually think kind of the overall development goes for both areas. I think marketing as a discipline, as a function, has a much longer tradition for using data, and they have many more. They are able to follow the impact of their activities on a much more granular and frequent basis than what we have traditionally done on the comp side. There's also a bigger investment typically when you do marketing activities, so that might have driven the need for actually being able to prove what is our return on investment. But I definitely think we can learn something in the comms world from the marketing world on that one. HR is another, what can we learn from HR? They tend to, at least I've seen a development throughout the past, 10 years. They are also more data-driven than what they used to be. I still sense, and there are big differences, but in too many instances, communication is just, this is something that you need to do, and then we do it, and then what is the impact? We don't know, but
So just to wrap up, a couple of more fun questions. Are there any myths about communications that drive you crazy? Things that you always hear that people assume about communications or people say about communications that you think, that's just so not true?
I don't know whether they say it, but when you are, called in last minute, so when the business has gone through, a long decision process, and then you call communication and say, hey, we need to get this out. This is, please stop it. Because, of course, if you are part of the decision process, you can bring that multi-stakeholder perspective in. And then, there might be small tweaks that you can do in the decision, which will make the decision fly much better with your stakeholders instead of just, assuming that comms can then fix the press release and then everything is done and dusted, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the assumption that comms is not needed to make the decision; it's needed to message the decision, in a sense.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it.
So we've talked a lot about staying always on, and I'm curious to ask, how do you switch off?
Oh, I do yin yoga. Breath work.
Good way.
Yeah.
And you probably didn't have a lot of time for that over the last few weeks, closing such a massive
but I will,
acquisition.
a few hours there, I will be there on the mat. And it's important also getting back to, you can get all the data in the world and have an amazing team and a strong mandate. But to me, there's still, something which is more intangible and based on years of experience, and to connect with that I at least need a bit of downtime, and I sense when I haven't had it, I lose that thing.
Yeah, I totally understand. Pia, it's been lovely to have you on the show. Thank you so much. We very much appreciate your taking the time in such a busy period to talk to us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Many thanks for listening to this episode of Always On. If you haven't done so already, check out some of the other episodes. They're packed with unique insights from seasoned experts at leading companies. Oh, and if you have any comments or questions about anything you've heard on the pod, we'd love to hear from you. Just drop us a line at podcast@groupcaliber.com. Thanks again for listening. Till next time, take care.